Welcome to the History Maps podcast.
Right, so today we're getting into what I'd call a historical paradox.
Yeah, and this is part of our Southeast Asian history series. Think about building a civilization that is so structurally advanced, so fundamentally sound, that its hollow, vaulted brick temples can survive a massive earthquake 8 centuries later.
Almost entirely intact, too.
Right, exactly. We were looking at a society that basically mastered engineering, geometry, resource mobilization, you name it.
But then, the very same society that built these indestructible physical foundations, well, they completely bankrupted themselves into oblivion just to pay for them.
Yeah, they built this literal forest of stone, and in the process, they engineered their own economic collapse. So we are venturing into the pagan kingdom.
Or frequently referred to as the Bagan Empire.
Right. And this state thrived from the mid-9th century, specifically around 849 until 1287. It acted as the charter polity that laid the permanent political, cultural, and administrative foundation for modern-day Myanmar.
And that is really our mission for this deep dive. We're going to dissect the history, the highly decentralized governance, the rather fatal flaws in their economy, and, the lasting architectural legacy of an empire that completely reshaped its region.
I mean, we are talking about a civilization that managed to construct over 10,000 brick temples, stupas, and monasteries.
Right there in the Irrawaddy Valley.
Yeah, so they fundamentally altered the physical landscape, but they also locked in the cultural trajectory of Southeast Asia for centuries to come.
They really did.
And for you listening, if you have any interest in the actual mechanics of state building, like how a small, highly localized settlement manages to scale up and transform into a culturally dominant empire, this analysis is going to pull back the curtain on how that actually works.
Right. We are going to look closely at that complex, often precarious balance of power between, religious devotion, economic reality, and military might.
But before we can understand how this empire functioned on a daily basis, we have to understand who actually built it. And when looking at the sources provided for this analysis, there is a very stark, very immediate contrast between the empire's mythological origin story and what the physical archaeological record tells us.
Yeah, it is a classic division between how a culture chooses to view its own past, often for political legitimacy, right? And the unforgiving reality of what physical evidence leaves behind in the dirt.
Which is usually a very different story.
Exactly. If we look first at the chronicle tradition, specifically the local myths that were documented much later in texts like the Glass Palace Chronicle, well, the narrative traces the kingdom's roots all the way back to India in 850 BCE.
Oh, wow. I mean, 850 BCE that's quite a claim.
It is. And this chronicle claims the original founders descended directly from the specific clan of the Buddha.
Of course they did.
Right. The story asserts that a figure named Abhiraja fled a military defeat in India, traveled east, and founded a kingdom at Tagaung. Following this highly prestigious lineage, the chronicle then claims that much later, in the year 167, a king named Pusati officially founded the dynasty at the settlement of Bagan.
Okay, I have to pause right there and just push back on that timeline.
Yeah, please do.
Because a formal founding in the year 167 by direct descendants of the Buddha's clan, it just feels highly stylized.
Very stylized.
It reads like a foundational myth designed specifically to give a much later ruling class divine or, holy legitimacy. What does the physical evidence actually show us about the people living in this region during those early centuries?
So the physical evidence points in an entirely different direction. The modern scholarly reconstruction paints a much more gradual, grounded picture.
Right.
The archaeological record points not to Indian royals fleeing a battle, but to the Pyu city-states. Right. As early as the 2nd century BCE, the Pyu people had already established themselves. They had built sophisticated water management systems along the streams in the central and northern parts of the Irrawaddy Basin.
So they were already highly organized.
Very much so.
Yeah.
We're talking about walled cities, elaborate palaces, and a heavily Buddhist culture that was, sure, certainly influenced by contact with India, but fundamentally indigenous to the region. The Pyu were the dominant, thriving civilization in this specific area for many centuries.
But wait, if the Pyu were that well established, building walled cities and managing complex irrigation networks for hundreds of years, how do we get from a thriving Pyu civilization to the Burman people, the Maranma, founding the pagan empire?
That transition requires us to look outside the Irrawaddy Valley. It involves intense external conflict.
Okay, where are we looking?
We have to look north. specifically to the Nanzhao Kingdom, located in what is now Yunnan.
Right.
Between the 750s and the 830s, the Nanzhao launched a series of repeated, devastating military incursions down into the Piu realm.
Oh, I see.
And these were not just border skirmishes, you know. These attacks essentially shattered the political cohesion and the military structures of the Piu city-states. The Piu leadership was decimated, their defenses were breached, and their ability to govern the region just collapsed.
So it wasn't that the Burmans just showed up out of nowhere and conquered a powerful, unified enemy?
No, not at all.
The historical record suggests something much more opportunistic. Like, if we think about the Pew Round like a massive historic estate.
Okay, yeah.
It has been sitting there for centuries, incredibly well maintained, with complex irrigation running through all the gardens, secure walls, a large staff. Then a severe, unprecedented storm hits.
The Nanzhao military attacks.
Exactly. The storm completely wrecks the estate's defenses, blows the doors off the hinges, and scatters the original owners.
Right.
And because the property is now completely vulnerable and the owners are weakened, it basically opens the door for a new group of people to simply walk in and set up camp. These new arrivals are the Burman warriors, the Marama.
That's a great way to look at it.
They migrate southward into this shattered landscape and settle right at the highly strategic confluence of the Irrawaddy and Chinwin rivers. And this is in the 830s and 840s.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. The Marama migration was essentially an influx into a power vacuum. They moved into the space that the Piu could no longer securely hold or administer.
Right.
And we do not have to rely on guesswork to connect these early Marama settlers to their origins in the north. We actually have definitive linguistic evidence that ties them back to the Nanzhao sphere of influence.
Wait, linguistic evidence? How so?
The early pagan kings utilized a very specific, highly structured naming system that was entirely identical to the naming system used by the Nanzhao kings.
How does a naming system work as archaeological or historical evidence? What was the specific mechanism of this system?
So it was a system of patronymic linkage.
Okay.
Specifically, the father's last name became the son's first name.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it is a linguistic chain that physically links generations together in the historical record. The fact that the early rulers of Pagan used the exact same patronymic chain as the Nanzhao leadership cements the historical and cultural link between the migrating Burmans and the northern region they had either served, lived in, or interacted with before moving south.
It firmly confirms the gradual migration narrative over the mythological Indian origin story from the Chronicle.
Absolutely. It grounds it in reality.
Okay, so we have established who settled in the region, taking over this highly damaged estate. But settling at a river confluence is a long way from dominating Southeast Asia.
It's a very long way.
How does a relatively small group of incoming migrants turn a localized principality into a massive, structurally complex empire?
Well, to answer that, the sources point to one pivotal figure, and that is King Anurata.
King Anurasa.
Yes, he came to power in 1044. And it is crucial to understand the absolute scale of Pagan at the precise moment he took the throne. Pagan was not an empire yet.
Not at all.
It was merely a small, vulnerable territory comprising roughly 6% of modern Myanmar.
Just 6%.
Right. It stretched about 320 kilometers from north to south.
Yeah.
More importantly, this tiny sliver of territory was entirely surrounded by larger, established rival powers.
6% is a tiny footprint. If you are Anurata and you are surrounded by rivals, how do you even begin to scale up? I mean, you cannot just declare war on your neighbors if you lack the manpower.
No, you can't. You scale up by focusing exclusively on the economic engine, which in the 11th century meant agriculture.
Ah, right.
Anurata's immediate priority upon taking the throne was not military conquest. He recognized that military ambition without a secure food supply is just suicide.
Right.
He spent the entire first decade of his reign focused almost entirely on the arid Kyaksi district, which was located to the east of the capital. He poured vast amounts of state labor into building complex weirs and canal systems, systematically turning these parched, dry lands into a highly productive, hyper-efficient rice granary.
I found a detail in the sources about this specific period that really brings Anurata's administrative style to life. And, it shows why he was successful. He did not just sit in a throne room and order canals to be dug by nameless peasants.
No, he was very hands-on.
Right. He engaged in highly detailed statecraft. The sources indicate he personally surveyed the region. He graded every single town and village, based on a very precise calculation,
Which was?
the exact levy of manpower they could provide, and the exact amount of crops they could produce based on the new irrigation.
That's meticulous.
It is. By meticulously calculating the human and agricultural yield of every square mile, he transformed the entire region into a tightly managed district that became known as Ledwin, which translates directly to the rice country.
And that transformation of the Kyoxi district is the bedrock of everything that follows in the Pagan Empire. In a pre-industrial society, your control over the food supply dictates your absolute military capacity. Because Anurata secured a massive, reliable, and heavily monitored surplus of rice, he could suddenly support a much larger population.
And more people means.
Exactly. A
Ugh.
larger population directly translates into a larger standing army, more conscripts, and a vastly more extensive labor force for public works. Only after he spent 10 years securing the food supply was he finally ready to look outward and expand the borders.
So he builds the engine, fills it with fuel, and then puts the state in motion.
Yes.
Where did he send this newly fed, newly supplied army?
He launched highly coordinated campaigns outward in multiple directions. He pushed eastward into the nearer Shan Hills. He extended his conquests southward down into lower Myanmar, eventually reaching all the way to the Tenasserim coast.
Okay.
He also pushed westward into North Arakan. He was systematically securing the borders around his central agricultural hub.
What stands out here is the physical evidence of this expansion. We're not just relying on later court chroniclers claiming he conquered these areas to inflate his legacy.
No, the evidence is there.
Anurata left a very specific, undeniable material footprint across the landscape. To secure the east, he constructed a massive network of 43 individual forts all along the eastern foothills.
Wow, 43 forts.
Right. And in the south, archaeologists find terracotta votive tablets emblazoned with his specific name, written in Sanskrit, scattered all along the Tenasserim coastline.
This raises an important point about the mechanics of statecraft, though. Those forts and those stamped tablets are not just signs of military raids, they are permanent markers of administrative reach.
Exactly.
A fort requires a garrison, and a garrison requires supply lines. However, Anurata was astute enough to recognize that purely military and administrative control is brittle.
You can't hold it by force alone.
Right. You cannot hold a massive territory by force alone indefinitely. You require an ideological component to bind the people to the center.
Which leads directly to his religious shift.
It does. Early in his reign, Anurata converted from his native Arya Buddhism to Theravada Buddhism.
I want to stop and unpack that because on the surface, a king changing his personal religious practice might seem like a private matter.
Sure, it can seem that way.
Why does adopting Theravada Buddhism matter to the physical expansion of a medieval empire? How does that actually change the facts on the ground for his generals or his diplomats?
Because in this era, religion is diplomacy. It provided a massive strategic advantage. By officially championing Theravada Buddhism and making it the state-sponsored religion, Anurata aligned the pagan empire with other major Theravada networks across the region, most notably the religious and political powers in Ceylon.
Oh, I see.
Geopolitically, this specific religious alignment helped him secure and legitimize his control of the highly lucrative peninsular ports down in lower Myanmar. Furthermore, it effectively checked the westward expansion of the neighboring Khmer Empire.
Right, because the Karen Empire was different religiously.
Exactly. The Khmer Empire at this time was predominantly Hindu and Mahayana Buddhist. By establishing a firm Theravada frontier, Anurata created a distinct cultural and religious barrier. Religion became the unifying cultural force that tied his newly conquered disparate territories back to the central throne.
That makes perfect sense. He secures the calories, he conquers the territory, he builds the forts to hold the lines, and he establishes the religious framework to legitimize it all.
Step by step.
But expanding an empire is one thing. Governing it over generations is entirely another. How do the subsequent kings who inherited this massive territory actually manage it? They do not have modern telecommunications or rapid transit. How do you govern a sprawling 12th century empire?
To understand their governance, we have to look away from modern concepts of statehood and examine the mandala system.
The mandala system.
Yeah, this was the prevalent political and spatial model across Southeast Asia. A modern state has hard, clearly defined borders, and the laws formulated in the capital apply equally to a town right on the border. The mandala system operated on an entirely different spatial logic. Authority radiated outward from a highly concentrated core region.
The best way to conceptualize the mandala system is to think of a massive heat source, like an enormous bonfire.
I like that analogy.
Right, so if you were standing right next to the fire, which in this context is the capital city of Pagan and those highly irrigated agricultural hubs we talked about, like Kyoxi and Minbu, the heat is incredibly intense and direct. In that core zone, the king's authority is absolute. He directly appoints the local governors, he personally controls the distribution of land, and his officials collect taxes directly from the population.
Very direct control.
But as you walk away from the bonfire, out toward the peripheral regions and the tributary states, the heat naturally grows cooler and much more diffused.
That is precisely how the administration functioned. In those cooler peripheral regions, the tributary states located far from the Irrawaddy Valley, the pagan court did not attempt to exert direct, daily administrative control. It was too costly and logistically impossible.
So they just let them be.
Mostly, yeah. Instead, local, hereditary rulers were allowed to maintain their historical positions of power. They governed their own people according to their own local customs. However, they were required to acknowledge the supremacy of the pagan king.
By sending tribute.
Exactly. They did this by sending regular, highly formalized tribute to the capital and, crucially, by providing designated military levies whenever the pagan king called for a wartime mobilization. The crown's actual day-to-day authority was largely nominal the further away you traveled from the capital.
But even if you accept a highly decentralized periphery, managing the core of the bonfire and organizing the influx of tribute from dozens of vassal states requires a deeply sophisticated bureaucracy. You need accountants, lawyers, administrators. How did the court at the center actually evolve to handle the sheer volume of logistics?
It was a very gradual, multi-generational process of institutionalizing power. We see a major leap forward during the reign of King Sithu I, who ruled from 1112 to 1167.
Okay.
Under his administration, we see a massive push for standardizing the state. He introduced standardized weights and measures across the entire kingdom.
Let me jump in there, because standardizing weights sounds like a dry administrative footnote, but it is actually the foundation of an economy. How does a medieval king actually enforce standard weights across an empire where his authority is nominal in the periphery? What is the practical application of this?
You enforce it by making the standardized weight the only acceptable metric for taxation. You cannot effectively tax a massive population or facilitate long-distance trade if a unit of grain or a weight of silver means something completely different in every single village.
Right.
By distributing standard weights, the crown ensures that when a tax assessor demands a specific volume of rice from a village, the crown knows exactly how many calories it is receiving. Sithu I coupled this economic standardization with legal standardization. He issued an official, written collection of legal judgments to serve as binding precedents for all the courts across the empire.
So he is creating a consistent, predictable legal and economic framework. If you commit a crime or sign a contract, the rules are the same whether you are near the capital or somewhat further out.
Precisely. It creates systemic stability. Then, under his successor, Sithu II, who reigned from 1174 to 1211, the administration matures even further, to the point of delegating the king's own power.
Delegating it to who?
Well, Sithu II formally established the Huta.
The Futa.
Yeah. This was a privy council composed of senior ministers. This represents a massive shift in governance. The Hutar gradually took over the daily, grinding administrative duties of the empire and eventually even assumed direct military command from the king himself. The monarch was no longer expected to manage every single detail of the state or lead every army. He had an institutional bureaucracy to execute his will.
Since you brought up military command being delegated to a council of ministers, let's look at the actual muscle backing up this entire legal and administrative system.
Yeah.
A privy council issuing edicts still needs physical force to compel obedience, especially from those peripheral tributary states.
Definitely.
If the king isn't leading a centralized army, how is the military structured?
The military strength of Pagan relied fundamentally on the Kanda conscript system. It is important to note that the core of the professional standing army was formalized relatively late in the empire's history. It wasn't until 1174 that the palace guards were created.
So quite late.
Right. This provided a small, highly trained, permanent force whose primary duty was to defend the capital and the royal family. However, the vast majority of the offensive wartime army was not a standing force. It was raised rapidly through mass conscription.
But this conscription was not just handing pitchforks to random farmers when a war broke out, right? If you are fighting neighboring empires, you need specialized troops. How do you conscript specialists?
It was an incredibly organized, deeply entrenched system. The conscripts were drawn from specific, designated hereditary villages that specialized exclusively in particular military arts.
Wait, entire villages?
Yes, the state literally bred military capability into the geography. You had entire villages whose sole purpose, passed down rigidly from father to son through generations, was to capture, train, and ride elephants for the elephantry.
That's wild.
Other distinct villages specialized exclusively in raising horses and training cavalrymen. Still others specialized in river navigation and naval warfare. When the Huta declared war, the local chiefs of these specific regions were legally required to supply their predetermined quota of highly trained, specialized men from their jurisdictions.
If the state is calling up quotas from specialized villages across the core of the empire, how large of a force could this system mobilize for a major campaign?
The logistical capacity was immense. Modern estimates suggest the pagan military could reach troop levels anywhere from 30,000 to 60,000 men during a major mobilization.
That is a staggering amount for that era.
To put the scale of their specialized units in perspective, we can look at later Chinese accounts documenting the Battle of Nagasongan. The Chinese records noted with significant alarm that the Burmese fielded thousands of infantrymen supported by an astonishing 800 war elephants in a single engagement.
I want to linger on that detail for a moment. 800 war elephants on a single battlefield. If you think about the logistical demands of just feeding an elephant, let alone transporting it, armoring it, and keeping it disciplined in the chaos of battle alongside 800 others. The caloric and financial demands of fielding an army of that size are just astronomical.
They really are.
Which brings us to the most critical question of this entire deep dive. Running a sophisticated privy council, enforcing standardized laws, fielding tens of thousands of specialized conscripts, and breeding hundreds of war elephants requires a mountainous volume of wealth. How did the pagan economy actually generate and process that kind of money?
What's truly fascinating and somewhat counterintuitive given their level of administrative sophistication is that the pagan empire completely lacked minted coinage.
Wait, what? No coins?
None. They did not produce or use standardized stamped metal coins like we see in the Roman Empire or other contemporary states. Instead, their primary medium of exchange for all major transactions was lump silver, and its value was determined strictly based on its physical weight at the moment of the transaction.
That seems incredibly cumbersome for a massive empire. If I want to buy a herd of horses or pay a tax bill, I have to physically weigh chunks of silver on a scale for every single transaction.
Yes, and it was even more complex than that, because the purity of the lump silver varied wildly depending on where it was mined or who traded it.
So you're constantly assessing purity, too.
Exactly. Merchants and tax collectors had to constantly weigh the silver and assess its purity, which introduced significant friction into daily commerce. The base unit of this entire weighing system was called the silver kyat. It is vital to remember the kyat was a unit of weight, roughly equal to 16.3 grams of silver, not a physical coin you could hold in your pocket.
Right. To give you listening a grounded sense of what a kyat could actually buy in this 12th century economy, the sources provide some highly specific data points that translate this abstract weight into daily survival. A standard basket of paddy, which is unhusked rice directly from the field, costs 0.5 kyats.
Okay, half a kyat for a basket.
Right. If you wanted something sweeter, one vis of honey of this, being a larger unit of weight used for commodities, cost 1.25 kyats. And if you were dealing in high-end trade or hoarding wealth, one kyat of pure gold was valued at 10 silver kyats.
Those everyday commodity prices are very useful for establishing a baseline. But to truly understand the economic engine of this empire, we have to look at the macro-level expenditures of the elite.
Which are massive.
Beyond massive.
Oh.
This society concentrated and deployed wealth on a scale that is difficult to fathom, primarily for religious purposes. Building one of the large, elaborate temples in the capital could cost a royal sponsor over 44,000 kyats.
44,000?
Right. To contextualize that, remember a basket of rice is half a kyat. We're talking about the caloric equivalent of nearly 90,000 baskets of rice for a single building. Furthermore, religious literature was a luxury of the highest conceivable order. We have records from the year 1273 showing that commissioning a complete copied set of the Buddhist Tripitaka cost a staggering 3,000 kyats.
Wait, let's look at the math here. If a working family is dealing in fractions of a kyat for their daily rice, and the elite are dropping 44,000 kyats on a single temple, and we know they built over 10,000 of these structures, that represents an almost predatory accumulation of resources. Where is the crown actually getting all this silver to fund this relentless construction?
The wealth flowed upward through agricultural surplus from the irrigated districts, heavy taxation on the commoners, and control of the trade routes. However, the exact mechanism the elite used to fund these massive religious monuments contained a deeply fatal flaw.
A flaw in the economy.
Yes, it was an economic loophole intentionally designed into the pagan legal system that would ultimately prove disastrous to the survival of the state. Wealthy royals, senior court officials, and the kings themselves engaged in a continuous competitive process of donating vast, highly productive acreages of agricultural land directly to the Buddhist clergy.
Why would they do that?
The motivation was deeply psychological and spiritual. They were attempting to attain religious merit to ensure better conditions in their future reincarnations.
Making a donation to a monastery seems pious. But what actually happens to the legal status of that land once it is formally donated to the clergy?
The moment the deed is transferred, the land becomes permanently, irrevocably tax-exempt.
Permanently tax exempt.
Permanently. But it was not just the dirt itself. The cultivators, the farming families who were physically tied to that land, were also permanently removed from the royal tax rolls. From the moment of donation forward, those farmers no longer owed any grain taxes to the king, and they no longer owed any military service to the Huta. Their labor, their crop surplus, and their physical bodies belonged entirely, exclusively to the monastery.
I have to stop right there because this makes absolutely no sense from a statecraft perspective.
It really doesn't.
If you continuously take your most productive, irrigated farmland, the exact land Anarata built the empire upon, and you give it away to a tax-free entity who pays to run the state. If the heat source of the mandala system requires constant fuel in the form of grain taxes and conscripted labor, and the kings are constantly making their best fuel legally exempt from being burned, doesn't the fire eventually just go out?
That is the exact paradox of the pagan empire. They engineered their own demise through piety. Initially, in the early centuries, these donations stimulated the economy. Monasteries would take wild land, clear it, and develop it, expanding the agricultural footprint. But over the span of 200 years, as more and more existing, highly productive land was transferred to the tax-free column, it became a slow, irreversible draining of the crown's vital resources.
They were just giving it all away.
The kings were enthusiastically giving away the very tax base and the very manpower they desperately needed to pay their palace guards, maintain their canal networks, and reward their loyal officials.
This realization that the fundamental stability of the empire depended entirely on the tax status of the people tied to the land naturally requires us to look closer at those very people. Who actually lived in this empire? If your life changes entirely based on whether the king or a monk owns your field, how was this society actually structured from the ground up?
Demographically, at its zenith, the pagan empire supported a total population estimated at roughly 1.5 to 2 million people. The capital city of Pagan itself was a massive urban center for its time, housing an estimated 200,000 residents prior to the late 13th century.
In managing a population of 2 million people, drawing from centuries of various conquests, migrations, and shifting borders, the sources bring up the concept of Burmanization. The Burmans migrated in, but how did they unify such a diverse group of indigenous people under one cultural umbrella?
The empire they forged was fundamentally an ethnic mosaic.
Mm-hmm.
You had the ruling Burman elite at the center, but you also had the original Pew populations, the Mon people down in the southern coastal regions, the Shans in the eastern hills, and various other linguistic and ethnic groups.
Very diverse.
Yes. However, the Burmans controlled the military, the economy, and the patronage. Because the pagan state was highly successful and secure, a natural process of social assimilation occurred. Over several generations, the pious and other subjugated groups gradually adopted the Burman identity. They learned the Burmese language, adopted Burman dress, and integrated into Burman cultural norms.
So, adopting the language and the culture of the conquerors wasn't necessarily forced by the sword. It was a highly practical pathway to social mobility. If you wanted to trade in the capital, or serve in the bureaucracy, or simply avoid being marginalized as a peripheral outsider, you became Burman.
That's right.
But even within that newly homogenized, assimilated culture, the daily reality of the society was incredibly rigid.
It was a highly stratified, legally bound society. Setting aside the royalty and the high-ranking officialdom at the very top, the vast majority of the population, the commoners, fell into highly specific, legally defined groups. Your entire life was dictated by your group's specific obligations to the state.
Let's compare two of these commoner groups to understand what life was actually like on the ground. On one hand, you have a group called the Kunda. These were the hereditary royal servicemen.
Right.
They were deeply integrated into the state apparatus. They received direct land grants from the crown to farm. And crucially, because they served the king, they were completely exempt from paying personal head taxes. In exchange for this tax-free land, they owed regular, mandatory military or civil service directly to the crown. They are the generational backbone of the specialized army we discussed earlier, the elephant riders and the cavalrymen.
Yes, the core military groups.
Right. On the other hand, you have the Athi. These were commoners who lived on communally held village land, not royal land grants. Because they did not owe regular specialized military service to the king, the state extracted its value from them in a different way.
Through taxes.
Exactly. They paid punishingly heavy head taxes.
And the distinction between those two groups was rigid. But then you have a third category of commoner, which ties directly back to the fatal economic loophole we just discussed, the payakyun. These individuals were private bondsmen, and their labor was dedicated entirely, exclusively to the monasteries and the thousands of temples dotting the landscape.
Because they were the farmers physically tied to those massive tracts of tax-exempt religious lands.
Exactly. When a king or a wealthy minister donated a village to a temple, the Athi, or the Kunda, living in that village, suddenly became payakyun. Because their agricultural labor and their physical maintenance of the temple were now dedicated to religion, the state legally recognized them as completely exempt from both royal taxation and military conscription.
Wow, that's a massive shift for those people.
It is. As the feverish pace of temple building increased and the amount of donated land grew exponentially, the number of payakyun in the population skyrocketed. This directly, mathematically, sapped the state's available manpower. Every new payakyun was one less soldier for the army and one less taxpayer for the treasury.
To understand how these incredibly diverse social classes, with their wildly different tax burdens, legal obligations, and ethnic backgrounds, managed to coalesce into a functioning, unified society for over 2 centuries, we need to look at the intellectual and spiritual landscape. What was the cultural glue that prevented this highly stratified society from fracturing?
Language was intended to be a primary unifier, but its widespread adoption was surprisingly slow. The formal Burmese alphabet, which modern scholars strongly believe was likely derived from older Mon or possibly Pew scripts, did not actually become the dominant official written language of the royal court until the 12th century.
Really? That late?
Yeah. Prior to that, the older Piedmont languages were still frequently used for official royal inscriptions and legal documents.
It is deeply important to point out just how exclusive the concept of literacy was during this entire period. We mentioned earlier that a copied set of the Tripitaka cost 3,000 silver kites. Because the physical production of manuscripts was so prohibitively expensive, reading and writing were an absolute guarded monopoly. Literacy was restricted exclusively to the highest aristocrats and the senior monks. The average commoner, whether they were a tax-paying Athi or a royal Kunda, had absolutely zero access to written texts.
Therefore, the state could not rely on disseminating written propaganda or theological texts to unify the masses. The transmission of culture, imperial ideology, and religion to the general population relied entirely on massive visual architecture and vibrant oral traditions. And the religion they were transmitting orally and visually was not nearly as strictly orthodox as later histories might assume.
Right. There is a very common assumption that because King Anurata famously converted the state to Theravada Buddhism to secure geopolitical alliances, pagan instantly became a purely, strictly Theravada Buddhist society. But the sources provided challenge that assumption heavily.
The religious landscape of the pagan empire, as experienced by the people living in it, was highly fluid and deeply syncretic. While Theravada Buddhism received the bulk of the royal patronage, funded the massive temples, and became the primary faith of the court, it did not exist in a vacuum. It coexisted intimately with and frequently absorbed elements of Mahayana Buddhism, various esoteric tantric practices, and older Hindu traditions that had circulated through the trade routes.
The sources provide a really vivid vignette that illustrates exactly what this syncretism looked like on the ground, and it is fascinating. We have historical records detailing the practices of the forest dweller monks, who were also known as the Ari monks.
The Arya monks, yeah.
These individuals were not marginal figures. They wielded significant political and spiritual influence right at the pagan court. Contemporary inscriptions describe their daily practices, which would be considered incredibly scandalous, if not outright heretical, by later, more orthodox Theravada Buddhist standards.
For sure.
The records show the Ari monks consumed hearty evening meals, which violates monastic fasting rules. They drank liquor publicly and ceremonially, and most shockingly, they presided over elaborate animal sacrifices.
The presence and influence of the Ari monks highlight how deeply local, indigenous traditions blended seamlessly with formal, imported religion. The royal court itself, despite funding Theravada stupas, also heavily sponsored massive, elaborate propitiation ceremonies for Nat spirits.
Yeah.
Nats are indigenous, deeply revered local deities, often representing the spirits of nature, specific geographic features, or powerful ancestors. Additionally, the population engaged heavily in the worship of Nagas, which are powerful serpent deities associated with water and the earth.
Overseen by shamans, right?
Yes, this specific practice was generally overseen by specialized local shamans, not Buddhist monks. So, while the intellectual elite might quietly study Orthodox Buddhist texts in the monasteries, the daily religious life of the empire, from the king down to the farmers, involved a highly complex daily negotiation with a vibrant pantheon of spirits, sacrifices, and local deities.
Having discussed their vast concentration of wealth, the rigid legal structure of their social classes, and the deeply syncretic, visually driven nature of their faith, we absolutely have to look at the physical manifestation of all these elements combined. We must discuss the monumental architecture of pagan.
The architecture is really, it's incredible.
This is, without question, what the empire is most globally famous for today.
The sheer scale of the construction undertaken in the Irrawaddy Valley is difficult to overstate or even comprehend. Over the course of 2.5 centuries, the rulers, the wealthy ministers, and the elite of pagans commanded the construction of over 10,000 distinct brick structures across the landscape.
10,000.
The labor required to bake the bricks, transport the materials, and execute the masonry is staggering. Today, even after centuries of erosion and seismic activity, over 2,000 of these massive temples and pagodas are still standing, utterly dominating the modern plains of Bagan.
When you look at the images of these thousands of structures, you immediately notice two very distinct, fundamentally different building styles dominating the skyline. How do we differentiate the architectural purpose of these buildings?
The architecture generally falls into two major functional categories. First, you have the solid stupa, which is also commonly referred to as a pagoda. A stupa is a massive, completely solid brick structure. There's no interior space to enter.
Completely solid.
Yes, it is typically built to safely enshrine a holy relic or a sacred text deep within its core. The pagan stupas did not appear out of nowhere. They evolved distinctly from an earlier, older Indian hemispheric design.
The evolution of that specific design over time is really visually striking. If you trace the centuries, you can see the original squad dome shape becoming progressively longer, stretching upward into a much more elegant bell-shaped form. The architectural elements on the exterior shifted as well.
Yeah, they did.
The ceremonial parasols that traditionally sat on top of the dome gradually morphed into a towering series of concentric brick rings pointing sharply toward the sky. And the very apex of the structure developed into a distinct, elongated point known as a banana bud. You can see this specific, fully realized pagan style perfectly preserved in structures like the famous Shwedagon Pagoda.
The second major architectural category stands in stark contrast to the solid stupas. These are the hollow temples, widely known as the Gai style. Unlike the solid pagodas, the Gai style temples were highly complex, hollow structures. They were designed specifically to be entered.
For what purpose?
They were built for active internal meditation and intricate devotional worship. They featured incredibly spacious interior vaulted chambers, sweeping pointed arches, and labyrinthine internal corridors that often housed massive statues of the Buddha.
There is a notable, rather profound historical tragedy regarding the construction of these hollow temples. The masonry skills and the keystone arching techniques developed by the master craftsmen in Pagan were incredibly, almost impossibly advanced. The bricks were laid with such precision that it is often said you cannot fit a knife blade between them.
That's right.
They were so structurally perfect, and the physics of their arches were so sound that many of these immense hollow brick buildings survived a massive, devastating earthquake in 1975, largely intact. Yet, despite proving their architectural genius, these highly specific mathematical vaulting techniques were entirely lost to later generations.
Completely lost.
When later Burmese kings in subsequent centuries attempted to replicate the spacious, soaring, vaulted interiors of the pagan temples, they failed completely. Their arches collapsed because the complex architectural knowledge had simply vanished.
It is a sobering, profound example of how a society can permanently lose critical, highly advanced technological and engineering knowledge when its central institutional structures collapse. The master builders were either scattered, killed, or no longer funded, and the oral transmission of that geometry died with them. And the collapse of those institutional structures brings us directly to the final, tumultuous phase of the pagan empire.
This circles back perfectly to the fatal economic flaw we discussed at length earlier. Building a literal forest of stone, 10,000 massive brick monuments eventually and unavoidably bankrupted the state. The cracks in the foundation of the empire were entirely economic long before they were ever military.
If we connect the timeline of the architecture to the bigger picture of the tax-exempt land donations, we see a critical mathematical tipping point reached by the late 13th century, roughly around the year 1280.
1280.
By that specific time, after generations of compounding pious donations, modern historical estimates suggest that up to two-thirds of all the cultivatable, highly productive agricultural land in Upper Myanmar had been legally donated and registered as tax-free religious property.
Two-thirds. Over 60% of the entire agricultural engine that Anarata built is completely legally removed from the state's tax base.
Yes, the mathematics of the state simply broke. The crown could no longer generate the sheer volume of grain or silver revenue required to feed and pay its professional military, maintain its canal infrastructure, or retain the loyalty of its peripheral courtiers through new land grants. The heat source at the absolute center of the mandala system had simply run out of fuel. The internal stability, the bureaucratic machinery, and the military readiness of the empire were already failing rapidly when an unprecedented massive external threat appeared on the northeastern horizon.
The Mongols. Specifically, the terrifyingly efficient military machine of the Yuan dynasty under the direct command of Kublai Khan. The Mongols, expanding their massive continental empire, sent diplomatic envoys demanding formal submission and heavy tribute from the pagan court in 1271, and they sent them again in 1273.
And King Narathipati was on the throne.
Right. Perhaps he severely underestimated the geopolitical reality of the Mongol threat, or perhaps he was simply unable to project weakness to his restless vassal states given his trembling internal economy. Whatever the calculus, he flatly refused to pay the tribute. Consequently, the Mongols, who did not tolerate refusal, invaded.
The ensuing military conflict systematically dismantled the remnants of the empire. In 1277, the Burmese army mobilized to meet the threat. Despite fielding their specialized troops and deploying their massive war elephants, the Burmese military was thoroughly defeated by the highly mobile, tactically superior Mongol cavalry at the Battle of Negasongya. The Mongol forces, utilizing their archers to panic the elephants, shattered the defensive lines and pressed relentlessly southward into the Irrawaddy Valley in the following years.
King Narathihapate's response to this catastrophic invasion earned him a rather ignominious permanent title in the historical chronicles. Instead of rallying his remaining forces or organizing a bitter defense of the capital city and its 10,000 temples, he abandoned it. He fled pagan entirely and retreated deep into lower Myanmar.
Right.
Because of this, he became known forever in the chronicles as the king who ran away. His cowardly flight caused a total, immediate collapse of central authority and morale. The periphery immediately recognized the center was dead. He was eventually assassinated by his own son. By 1287, the magnificent capital city fell, and the 250-year-old political entity of the pagan empire effectively disintegrated.
And all the tributary vassal states, no longer feeling the heat of the central bonfire, immediately revolted and declared total independence. What's deeply fascinating about the aftermath of this collapse is that the Mongols never actually fully occupied the pagan heartland. Their strategic goal in Southeast Asia seemed to be the fragmentation of rival powers, rather than establishing permanent, costly administrative control. Having destroyed the central authority, they largely withdrew, creating a massive political power vacuum in the region.
A vacuum that was quickly filled.
Into this chaotic vacuum stepped three brothers. They were former pagan military commanders, hailing from the nearby highly irrigated region of Myeongsang. Because they understood the pagan military and administrative systems, they were able to systematically drive out the remaining weak, Mongol-backed figureheads. By 1297, these three brothers successfully established the Myeongsang kingdom, taking firm control of what remained of the agricultural core of central Myanmar.
So, the physical, political entity of the pagan empire falls apart under the combined weight of Mongol cavalry and its own catastrophic tax-exempt land policies. But what is its actual legacy? We called it the charter polity at the very beginning of our analysis. Even though the central political structure collapsed, the software of the empire, its administrative, legal, and cultural norms survived entirely intact.
It did.
The various successor states that rose in the aftermath, whether they were ultimately ruled by Burmans, Shans moving in from the hills, or Mons in the south, universally adopted pagans' highly developed systems of law, their standardized weights and measures, their religious frameworks, and their intricate court protocols.
If we contrast pagans' historical legacy with another great contemporary Southeast Asian power, the Khmer Empire, the sheer resilience of pagans' cultural software is striking. Both of these massive empires suffered catastrophic political and infrastructure collapses. However, when the Khmer Empire ultimately fell, they largely lost their regional cultural dominance to the incoming Thai and Lao immigrants who moved into their territory. The demographic shift essentially replaced the existing cultural norms with new ones.
But in the Irrawaddy Valley, the exact opposite scenario played out. The Shan and lowland immigrants who actively moved into the political power vacuum left by the Mongols and who actually took over the political landscape did not erase pagan culture. They completely adopted the Burmese cultural norms, they adopted the Burmese language for their courts, and they firmly maintained Theravada Buddhism as the state religion.
They assimilated completely into the cultural framework of the very empire that had just been politically destroyed. The centuries-long process of Burmanization that King Anuradha and his successors had started proved to be vastly more durable and permanent than the physical borders of their state or the vaulted roofs of their temples.
Which leaves you listening with a final, somewhat philosophical thought to mull over. We generally study historical empires strictly through the lens of their aggressive military conquests, their massive territorial peaks, and their inevitable violent falls. But how often, in the broad scope of human history, does a politically shattered, conquered culture possess such deep, undeniable administrative and ideological gravity that it ends up completely assimilating its new conquerors, effectively turning a catastrophic military and economic defeat into a permanent, long-term cultural victory?
It's definitely something to think about.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.